Thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for testifying here today. It's some pretty fascinating perspective that I'm hearing. I'd go first to Mr. Garvey, and I want to make sure that I was listening carefully. When you spoke of the impeachment of President Clinton, was it your assertion that the Senate rejected the House impeachment resolution?
No, what I was saying, Congressman, was that this committee approved 4 articles of impeachment against President Clinton: perjury before the grand jury, perjury in a civil deposition, obstruction of justice, and providing false and misleading statements to a congressional committee. The House as a whole approved only 2 out of those 4 articles.
And the Senate, did you speak to the Senate's conclusion?
I did not speak to the Senate.
Okay. I'm glad I clarified that, because I wanted to make that point, and it happens to go back to an earlier conversation I had before this hearing began with Professor Turley, and just to be able to put it into the record that when we got a vote in the United States Senate on those charges that they took up and determined to try President Clinton on, all of those questions that came before the Senate were wrapped up into one question, which was, is he guilty of these various charges, and if so, is it in your judgment that it is worthy to remove him from office if he is guilty? And it allowed every senator to cloak themselves in whatever argument suited them politically, and the American people never got a verdict from the United States Senate. And that's a big disappointment to me, that one of the highest constitutional duties that can be served up to the United States Senate, to not have history record a verdict after a trial in the Senate. So I bring that point up for that reason.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
Yes, I would.
I thank the gentleman for, I'll be very quick also to add to the record. I might note, having been one of the House managers in the impeachment of President Clinton, the House managers were limited to just 3 witnesses, and those all had to be done by videotape. So our hands were, to a great extent, we were handcuffed. Thank the gentleman.
I thank you. Reclaiming my time, and I wish I had more time. I would yield to jump from New York.
Yeah, I'm just curious about what you just said. You said the Senate never reached a verdict. The Senate voted down the articles of impeachment. Isn't that a verdict?
No, reclaiming my time. I'm happy to take that up at another time. I'd be very, very interested to do so, and Mr. Nadler knows I mean that. So I'd turn instead to Mr. Gerhardt, and I will make this assertion that, well, as an employer, and I have been since 1975, our employees are at-will employees. We can dispatch them or fire them, remove them from their office for any reason or no reason at all, provided we're not violating a specific law. And I would put this Congress in that kind of a concept with regard to the executive branch employees who are going outside the bounds of their job, violating the Constitution. Your position was, I believe, that we need to that there needs to be malicious intent, and they have to be serious bad conduct. I would assert instead that Congress gets to decide what that is, and we could be as specific as we like or as vague as we like, but I would submit that if Congress decided to impeach perhaps the director of the IRS, that we could do so for any reason or no reason at all, and it comes back to the political foundation of what would the consequences be if Congress just said, we decided to have a closed hearing and we're going to impeach the director of the IRS to get this over with and send a message to the President and the American people, we're not going to mess with this kind of persecution against especially conservatives. What do you think the consequences would be if Congress took that position?
Well, sir, so 2 quick thoughts. The first is, in the corporate world, in the corporate example, board of directors are not able to fire CEOs for gross negligence or gross incompetence. They actually there has to be at least deliberate indifference. In other words, there has to be some bad faith. The second point is that all powers, including the impeachment power, are limited. The Constitution limits every governmental authority. And so there's, again, you can't impeach at least...
So what would the consequences be if Congress decided to impeach without making a public case and just simply said, we have our reasons and we've impeached? What would the consequences be to Congress for such an act, presuming that the Senate removed from office?
I'm sorry, presuming the Senate actually removed somebody
Yes.
after that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the consequences are comprised in part by what the Senate does. But if the House simply impeaches and doesn't have evidence and doesn't back it up, the consequences that actually are political. They're, you know, there's not like a court could strike that down, I don't believe. And you take the political heat, in a sense, the political consequence for that. But also one consequence is how the Senate treats what you do.
Watching as my time has expired, I would just submit that I appreciate that answer, because in the end of this, it's a political question before this United States Congress, the House and the Senate. And when the other branches of government violate the Constitution, it falls back to us to make the political decision, and that's one of the very few ways that we can enforce. And if I had more time, I would pose a question as to what would happen if Congress would expand its powers into the executive and judicial branch in the fashion that the judicial and the executive branch are expanding their powers into our legislative branch. But I'll leave that as a rhetorical question and yield back the balance of my time.